I guess in my 52-year railroad career, I have walked to the moon and back on railroad platforms just like this in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And I've come to know there are a lot of untold stories and even a few secrets out there involving the railroad industry. Please join us and subscribe so we can continue to bring you those untold stories and even a few secrets from America's railroad past.
All aboard! Highball it, Eagle!
Have you heard the travel news about the Eagle Way? To your destination happening every day. The Texas Eagle is clicking on the rail. From the Windy City to the Alamo, meet you at the station, come on, let's go. People get ready and catch the wave. Catch the wave, the Texas Eagle Way. Through the heart of the nation of travel.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome again to my podcast. I've seen some trains before. Griff Hubbard here again with you, and we appreciate you being with us. But I'm even more appreciative of a gentleman being with us this afternoon today, Bill Sheridan. William Sheridan, one of the finest men I ever had the privilege to work with and around and be with. I always told him, in fact, I just told him here a moment ago, there were a couple of three high-level Amtrak officials, Mr. Sheridan, who had to be nice to me because they knew Joy Smith wouldn't tolerate it. But you were nice, and even when you didn't have to be. And all those many years, I've never forgotten it and always been appreciative. Sir, let's just start at the beginning. Where are you from originally?
Denver, Colorado.
Wow, I didn't know that. Born and reared there, as we say in the South?
Yes.
Okay. Wow. So in your backstory, that's how come you put down, I'm guessing, a ski train as a pre-Amtrak story?
Yeah, that's correct. My parents weren't skiers, but they decided to give myself, my brother, and two sisters the opportunity to ski. And there was an Eskimo ski club that took the Rio Grande ski train from Denver to Winter Park every Saturday. And so we'd take the train up and back. And kind of the funny thing there was my parents were trying to check it out. And so we went up because the last car was an open car for anyone. And then they had a whole bunch of cars that are related to the different age groups of the ski train. And we got in the wrong car and we got in the oldest car with the high school kids. And it was fairly raucous, but my parents decided that it was still okay. But it was fun to take the train up, ski during the day, and come back.
Or for those who are interested in railroad equipment, were they all coaches? Were there some lounge cars or first class cars or dining cars on it?
All coaches.
All coaches. Okay, because that's what, a 2-hour trip?
Probably closer to an hour and 15 hour. I'm trying to think. Yeah, I think we get there usually around 9:30, probably 2 hours. You're right. 7:30 to 9:30.
So there wouldn't really be any reason for food service.
No.
On those trains. How many cars do you remember? A long train?
I'm guessing, but probably 10.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Leaving from Denver Union Station?
Union Station, and then right on the other side of the Moffat Tunnel, it would pull over, drop us off. That's right where the ski area was. And then somewhere it would turn around and it would be back there by lunchtime usually, but we'd usually have lunch on the hill. And then 3:30, we'd have to be back on the train. And we loved it when the snow was so bad, they closed the pass. And so it wasn't too crowded because the cars couldn't get there, but the train could. But it's a great experience.
Wow. Okay, all weather rail passenger dependable transportation.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Then in your notes prior to our podcast here, then under pre-Amtrak travel, you're going to have to tell the boxcar story. What does that mean?
Well, actually, after I graduated from college, they're off, and I was a raft guide, and among other things.
Okay,
And
tell us about raft guide on a specific river.
it was mostly the Colorado River, the Green and Yampa River, Utah, Colorado.
Okay, so you were a big time raft guide, not a little shallows raft guide.
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Never did the Grand Canyon, but did the Colorado River above the Grand Canyon. But yeah, it was a fun job. But one time when we were just doing it for fun, the car that I was in broke down in Grand Junction, like on a Saturday,
The
and
automobile.
the automobile. We were coming back, so it was like a four-day trip. Um, Stayed in a hotel. The next morning, the guy went to get his car fixed. He came back and said they're not going to have a part till Monday. And so me and my buddy went out to, I was I-70 and stuck our thumb out trying to hitch a ride from about noon until, like 6:30, 7 o'clock at night. We probably didn't look like the kind of person you want to pick up, given that we had been on the river for 4 days. But I kept on hearing that there's a rail yard behind us, right? So I said, let's go check that out. So about 7, 8 o'clock at night, we walked over there and there's a train moving. And so moving east. So that's good. So we kind of ran along and hopped in an empty car and it stopped. And about maybe 20 minutes later, an employee came in, was walking down. There's a flashlight shining on us, checking out the boxcars, and said, "Hell, get out of there, you guys." So he asked us where we're going, and we said Denver. And he says, "Well, you're on a train going to Pueblo." So that would have been quite a story.
Yes.
But instead, he said, "That train over there is going to Denver." He told us where to get on. So we actually got in a car that there was actually three other people already in the car, three other guys, one old kind of typical hobo, as you would imagine, and two guys that were kind of rough and tough. And anyway, the 6:37 in the morning, we started and, pulled into Denver, maybe, 5 o'clock at night, and go through the Moffett Tunnel in a open boxcar. But it was, one-time experience. It was fun.
Yes, that's occurred in the decade of the 70s.
I would say, yeah, late 70s.
Late 70s. Well, of course, something like that is extremely dangerous now, but even by the late 70s, you were taking a chance
Yeah.
on who you were getting in a boxcar with to go into a dark tunnel. I bet you and your friend kept your eyes open.
Well, the two guys, the old hobo or whatever, the older guy left the first time the train stopped and got in another car, which was, if I ever did it again, I would have done that, because these two other guys, they kind of enjoyed telling us stories about the law of the boxcars, which is basically no law, and, robbing people and throwing them out of the train, while it's going. And, I think they enjoyed scaring us.
They ride with you all the way to Denver?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna guess. I've said on previous podcasts, Mr. Sheridan, I've been surprised at the number of Amtrak folk, officials especially, who admitted at heart that they had always wanted to go to work for the railroad, that it had been a childhood dream. I'm just shocked that of how many. It's been the majority
Yeah.
so far. But knowing a little bit about your story, I'm gonna guess that's not yours.
No, no.
Okay. You didn't grow up saying, I wanna be there someday out on the railroad.
No, not at all. I found myself, wife and daughter in Fort Worth, Texas, working for a company doing, it's actually a company that was a credit card company for a long haul truck company. So, I mean, it was transactions and, nothing to do with railroad. And I had done some market research, and I knew that this company was probably not long for for health reasons, as you know, it was kind of financially not in good shape. So I was looking
Sure.
for another job. And the guy who did the market research, I was telling him that I was looking for another job, and he says, "Hey, you want to work for Amtrak?" And so came home, told my wife, "Hey, I got a job. I got a chance to get a job in Chicago for Amtrak." And the good news is that she was raised in Dixon, Illinois, and loved Chicago. And I think any other city, she would have not wanted to leave Fort Worth. And she still was somewhat reluctant, but anyway, it turned out to be a good opportunity. So I went there, I think it was 95, and initially was responsible for market research, but kind of in the negotiating of salary, the Steve Scott, who hired me, said, I hired this guy for pricing, but I really think he needs to be supervised. So what if you take over responsibility for pricing also? I didn't have any experience in pricing, but I said, sure, I'll give it a try. And it was really kind of an interesting experience because when did you start with Amtrak?
I came over from the Texas and Pacific Railway in 1974.
Yeah. So you know about the SBUs,
Oh,
separate
oh,
business
sure.
units.
And
Yeah.
in fact, for the benefit of our audience, sir, if memory serves me correctly, in 1995, there really wasn't any pricing yet. There were no laddered fares or blue days or red days or I mean it was just pretty much a set maybe you had some seasonal prices, but otherwise there was in 1995 there was no sophistication yet to pricing, was there?
There actually was, they had a revenue management system. In fact, I won't go into the details, but the guy I worked for, I actually took, as you know from reading my resume, that I took a couple of years off and did some consulting in revenue management. And the guy who started that company asked Amtrak to be their first company. There's two guys there that did revenue management for Delta Airlines. They wanted to start their own company. They flew to Washington in a number of meetings, talked Amtrak into revenue management. Amtrak said, I want you to do we'll go with you. And they thought about it and they said, no, we won't do it. Because if our first company is a train company, we'll never get an
Oh,
airline.
wow.
But anyway, that was a couple years
Well,
before.
all right, just to make sure I understand, for the historical record, because I've never heard that story. Thank you. Just to make sure I got it right, it was really former Delta airline folk that talked Amtrak into having a pricing structure.
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
And then they ended up going to American Airlines and said, hey, these guys from Delta won't do it. Will you do it for us? And American Airlines said, sure. So American Airlines built the first revenue management system for Amtrak. So that was in place.
Wait, now Delta Airlines built
I'm sorry, American.
American.
Yeah.
So Amtrak paid American for that first system?
Yeah, it was called Sabre, and it was a subsidiary.
Sabre.
It was a subsidiary of American Airlines, and
Ah,
Amtrak contacted them and said, "Will you build a revenue management system for us?" And Sabre said, "Yeah." And so that was the origin of revenue management at Amtrak.
let me tell you what little I remember about Sabre. I remember that you had to have a notebook full of your own pen and ink changes, and there were a lot of verbiage that you had to personally enter.
Yeah, yeah.
There were no PF keys yet, or at least on our end there wasn't. You had to know what you were entering.
I'll bet. Yeah.
Okay, so if I could digress just a little bit in your story, something I didn't understand or that I missed. So the very first person that asked you if you wanted to go to Amtrak Market Research in Chicago, was that a headhunter or an Amtrak person, or who was that individual?
His name was Jerry Thomas, and he owned a market research company in Dallas, Texas.
Well, how would he have the gravitas to hire you at Amtrak?
He recommended. So he told Steve Scott, who had just signed on, to set up the marketing department for the long distance SBU, that you should look at Bill Sheridan.
Got it. Okay, so
Yeah.
you went to Chicago and interviewed.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
And so just, one of the inefficient kind of, trying to think what the right word would be, some of the decisions that Amtrak made from an executive level along the way didn't turn out to be very good. And I think the SBUs was an important one. That was a failure. But one of the things that was amazing was that when Amtrak decided to go with the SBUs, they created three. So there was the Northeast Corridor SBU. And from what I heard, that was the first one that was developed.
Could you tell our audience, what does SBU stand for?
Sure, it's a strategic business unit.
So you were, for a couple of years, you were down in Atlanta, Georgia, consulting.
Yeah.
But on revenue management.
Right.
Okay. Was that in the transportation? Was it related to transportation at all?
Mostly. Yeah. So, I mean, the transition, I'll just say that after working for 2 years at Amtrak, and taking over revenue management after about 6 months, because the people who were running revenue management out of Washington, just they really didn't seem to know what they were doing, and the system wasn't working, and I looked at some of the pricing that was available and it didn't make sense, and actually told them to take the long distance trains off the system and start managing them manually, because the system was just really doing stupid things. And I went back to Chicago, and Steve Scott, I told him, and he says, well, why don't you run it? And Mark Kane just, made it happen. He called up George Warrington and Gil Mallory and said, I got a guy who can do better with revenue management than what's happening here. And George Warrington said, we're about to take our trains off of revenue management because it doesn't make sense. Gil Mallory said, do I have to pay for it? And Mark Kane said, no. So he says, yeah, that's fine. So all of a sudden I was responsible for not just long distance pricing, but then I was responsible for national revenue management. Okay. So that was like 97.
Yes.
So then in 90, go ahead.
Just for our listeners, George, and I'm certainly asking for your verification. At that time, George Warrington was president of the Northeast Corridor Strategic Business Unit.
That's correct.
And Mark Kane was president of the Intercity Strategic Business Unit. And Gil Mallory was the West Coast president?
That's correct. Okay.
So now you're doing revenue management for everybody.
Correct.
Wow. You must have awakened one day and said to yourself, this is not exactly the way I had this planned.
No, I mean, I guess you could say it was a low bar, and so I came in, and I think, we made some progress, and we were just dealing everything manually. We didn't have a system. And so I was working with the people. I think there were 4 revenue managers, and we'll talk a little bit more. Probably you can talk about your experience as a revenue manager, which is a pretty cool story.
Oh no, sir. So just so you'll know, you'll be on the spot in advance. Oh no, I want you to tell the story of what y'all thought of us. Because see, we were not privy to that inside story. So that's
yeah. So anyway, in dealing with the revenue manager vendors, I had a conversation with one of these people in a company called Talus out of Atlanta. And he offered me
what is a revenue management vendor?
These are the companies that build revenue management systems. So they build the computers, and they sell them, and so this was 98. Business was probably very good in 98. And so he asked me to join them as a consultant. So I remember, did the interview, and they made the offer. And I remember telling my wife, Carol, that, and this was after 3 years at Amtrak. I said, this is the right move for us. This is a nice promotion, and it's a nice move for us. But I wouldn't be surprised when I retire if I look back and say the most fun job I ever had was at Amtrak. So I said that as I left.
Okay.
And so did that. So you asked about what we did. I've worked on various projects. Probably the project that I remember the most was with Harrah's Casino. So kind of a bizarre application of revenue management, but what Harrah's did was they took all of the people who gambled in their casinos and they kept track of how much money they spent. They didn't care if they won or not, but they just took advantage. They kept track of how much money they spent. So they were managing their hotel rooms. And so they were the first casino to do this, but the people who spent the most money got into a higher category. It's like gold, silver, platinum kind of thing, right?
All right. So they're revenue managing the price of their hotel rooms, not their ability to play at the table.
Right.
Okay.
And so, so what they would do is the high rollers, they would give them the room. They would comp them the suites, so it wasn't so much that they're going to charge the first class customer more money for the first class seat. They knew these people were going to come and spend a lot of money. And over time, they're probably going to lose more money than somebody who spends less. So Thales built a system, revenue management system, that forecasted the value of each of these players.
Wow.
And if there was a fight and they knew they were going to sell out or some big event, then they would contact these high rollers and say, we'll give you this suite for free and these packages, because they wanted to get people to come in to make more money at the gambling tables. And they were the first to do that. So that was a fun project. I was a project manager on that. And I did a little bit of consulting with Amtrak. And then 2 years later, Amtrak asked me if I wanted to come back.
That would have been in 2000.
And that was in 2000. And so George Warrington was president, and Barbara Richardson was in charge of marketing. And so I came back, and kind of in my old role, took over the revenue management and pricing for
the whole country.
For the whole country, yeah.
So as you and I well know, that is such a strategically important job, because revenue management on the Northeast Corridor is entirely different from revenue management in the long distance system, which is entirely different from revenue management on the West Coast trains. So, but here you have it all. Okay, this is in 2000. That brings us right to the crux of one of my inquiries here. Okay, so when you came in 2000, ladies and gentlemen, this poor man, this gracious poor man, inherited an Arkansas dentist. He inherited the Amtrak agent at Longview, Texas, myself, and the Amtrak agent at Austin, Texas, Jesse Padilla.
Jesse Padilla, yeah.
Who had been given the year before, who had been given autonomous control of the Texas Eagle between Chicago and LA. And I'm talking about no questions asked. It didn't matter if it was between Chicago and St. Louis, Little Rock and Dallas, or Benson, Arizona and Tucson. We were doing it. So I have to, that brings me to my first question. When you realized that was the case, what did you think? Did you think Mr. Warrington had lost his mind, or what did you think about that?
Yeah, I was pretty surprised. I, had probably a perception of, well, I could do better, or my team can do better. And so I went in thinking, well, what's this going to be about, but I was pleasantly surprised.
Shortly thereafter, and I am not going to name names here, maybe later in life if I live longer, but I'm not going to name names here. But, we had our detractors that did not think this was a good idea. But on your watch, not only did you inherit us, but then you shortly thereafter watched us training the local revenue management crew for the Crescent and the city of New Orleans.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden you had 3 long distance trains out there all being revenue managed by people on the ground in the field. And you and I have never discussed this at length, perhaps because we never had the opportunity to. But I do remember you saying, at least on the route of the Texas Eagle, that we produced some good results. And I don't want to put words in your mouth now. So if I'm misremembering, I want you to tell me.
No, that's true. I mean, as you know, revenue management is as much an art as a skill. And
Agreed.
measuring the impact of revenue management is very difficult because you don't know what would happen if you didn't make the change that you did. So, initially I thought, I love numbers and I love to dive into data. So, I was trying to figure out, okay, how do we measure the performance of trains? And so, revenue per available seat mile, RASM, was the most commonly used statistic. So for those people out there,
Correct.
if you think about it, if you're revenue managing a seat from Chicago to San Antonio, if you sell it at a really high price between Chicago and St. Louis and then it's empty for the remainder of the trip, your yield is going to be really high, because yield is, if I remember this, yield is what, price per mile. So you did really well, but you only sold the seat for a third of the mile. So revenue per available seat mile is basically saying, how did you do for that seat the whole time from point one, beginning to end? And so, looking at the RASMs, revenue per seat mile, for the Texas Eagle, it was, equal to or better than the average of the other long distance trains, as I recall. And I will say that the other trains, the City of New Orleans and the Crescent, did not do as well. I think that, and I think I was a little perturbed that you were training them and that I wasn't. It was kind of like,
I
I'll
understand.
let it manage the train, but I don't know if they can do training better than I can.
I completely understand that. And we also we trained them in Dallas over a week's long period, and it just happened to be that time that the Crescent Star was just inevitable, which we're now at that junction where it looks like the Crescent Star from Meridian to Fort is inevitable again. But we actually had that team trained who was going to revenue manage from Meridian
Yeah,
to Fort Worth
yeah, I
during
forgot
that
about
time
that.
period.
Who is the
We
mayor of Meridian?
John
John
Robert Smith, well,
John
he
Roberts.
was, who was also board chairman of Amtrak during this
Yeah,
period.
yeah,
And
yeah,
he's really involved hands-on with the the reinvigorated effort to get the Crescent Star
yeah,
back on.
yeah,
So uh, every great success, that's been an ongoing project for more than 30 years down in this
yeah,
part of the
yeah.
country. So it'll be interesting to see how it turns out. So the so the question is, okay, so in other words, you felt just like we felt. It's human nature, and I respect it highly and completely understand it. We can do it better than they can. Well, of course you would think you could do it better. You're trained to do. Who are these people? The good news is you haven't had to hear this ad nauseum like everybody else down here has. But I just would simply say, look, because it was the truth. I said, who do you think cleans the bathroom bowls in the depot at Longview? That is about as close as you can take revenue management to the passenger. You just can't get any closer to understanding who they are and why they travel. So it even surprised us. It was a project that lasted 20 years.
I know.
And do you know wonderful Bob Johnston, the writer for Trains magazine?
No, I don't.
he published a whole article on Richard Anderson in I don't have a copy of it, but in last month's Trains magazine, which I guess this is December, so I guess it would be the November issue of Trains. He wrote that the worst decision Richard Anderson made was to take local revenue management away from the Texas Eagle.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah, we appreciate it. But I tell you that story to say this. Isn't it funny that Delta Airlines brought Amtrak into this era and Delta Airlines took us?
Yeah.
So that's kind of coming full circle. So you moved to the finance department in 2007. So did you have to give up all revenue management responsibilities at that time?
Yeah, I did. And, one of the things that I've learned looking back is I think I was the right person at the right time when I was there in 2000. But I don't think I think I was kind of past my prime. Not that that's why I left. It was like I was looking for, a new challenge, and the planning department, Paul Nissenbaum was putting together a planning department, and I thought it would be a good move for me. And I enjoyed that move. But, Cheryl Richards replaced me as, the head of revenue manager. And I know that she had a different feeling about, revenue managing the trains than I did. And I understand that. But
yeah, it's okay to say it. Cheryl Richards did not care for us. And she made, I respect her for that. She made no bones about it. She did not hide how she felt. And, in fairness, I might say that we probably returned the favor.
Well, she also, I actually have a much different opinion of her as being in charge of revenue management. And she came from Eastern Airlines, and she was running revenue management there. And, the bottom line is that I didn't have the experience about revenue management. I didn't have the experience about modeling and the complexity of modeling. And she really took, especially in the Northeast Corridor, the Northeast Corridor was where revenue management really started making the money because, I think David Gunn is the greatest, right? But one thing about David Gunn is that he really was so focused on operations, and he did such a great job in turning around operations from what I could see in the time that he was there. And this was during that time, like 2000 or so to 2007 or shorter than that. But anyway, when I took over revenue management, we were not revenue managing the Metroliners or Acela. There was a weekday price and a weekend price, and it was all fixed. And I can remember having a conversation with him and telling him the real opportunity here is with business travelers, and business travelers who want to take the train. And this was after 9/11. So, 9/11 is the best thing that happened to Acela. Terrible thing. But they closed the national airport for like 8 months, and all these business travelers, and Acela had been around for about a year. And the air rail share, Acela had like, of the Washington to New York, these will be directionally accurate statistics. They're not, pinpoint, but, let's say 22% of the air rail share between Washington and New York. Well, after 9/11, and the only option you had other than driving to get from New York to Washington or back was taking the train, Philadelphia, et cetera. That was Acela. And after the airport opened, we were at 70, 80%, and it never went down. But we were not revenue managing it at the time. And so I remember telling David Gunn, we should be charging higher prices. And I remember David taking out the schedule. You remember the schedule we used to have, right? And the prices for Acela were in the schedule. And he opened to that page and he said, if I'm a business traveler and my plane is delayed, I want to be able to take out the schedule and look at what price I'd have to pay to take Acela, which is really kind of crazy because that person doesn't care about price. And I don't know how hard I tried to explain that to him. But anyway, it's something that, like I said, he was a great leader in many ways. But anyway, Cheryl Richards took over.
She came to us from Eastern Airlines.
Correct. And she was
And
a lot of experience with their revenue management system. She brought in some really smart people to do the modeling.
that's what I wanted to say. One of the finest, most knowledgeable revenue management people I ever worked with was Trey Romero.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think she brought him in.
Yes.
What a knowledgeable, that guy knows his business.
Yeah, yeah. And a great guy. Like you,
Yeah,
always
well,
smiling.
I never met him personally,
Yeah,
but I could feel that smile over the telephone.
There you go. Yeah. So, I had to explain to Cheryl, like, you must wonder how bad I was in revenue management, but I really tried to get Acela in the Northeast Corridor to be revenue managed, but wasn't able to. But within a year, she was revenue managing it, and but I think it's an example of good decisions at Amtrak versus not so good decisions at Amtrak. And David Gunn was the right decision, and he was great, and he did some really great things from an operating standpoint, and really, straightened some things out and improved a lot of financial cost reductions, et cetera. And but anyway, that's when I went to the planning department. Cheryl came in, and I just wanted to kind of do a side comment about it. I think that she was the right person at the right time. Admittedly, she did not understand the value that you were providing by your understanding of the customer in the field, but from a system standpoint and revenue managing the Northeast Corridor, I think she really contributed quite a bit.
Let me tell you what weight you hold with all of us. If you say she's good folk, we're going to change it. We're going to turn around and say she's good folk. If you say it, if you endorse it, we're there.
Okay.
So let me make an observation here, ladies and gentlemen. I want to make sure you understand in our working careers, although Mr. Sheridan is a humble man, and even I don't mean it with false humility here, but Mr. Sheridan was way up here and I was way down here. So we saw things our day-to-day work lives were entirely different in seeing the perspective of the company, the overall perspective. But I just want to ask you about an observation that I made in my 46 years with Amtrak. It always occurred to me, and I don't know how you would solve this, but the company would be headed in one direction, and then you would have a national political stage change in the Congress or in the White House, and almost the very next day the company's going in a, it's almost like throwing it in reverse at 100 miles an hour sometimes over the years. Is that, I mean, that's coming from my level, but did you experience that kind of feeling like, wait a minute, we had something that was going here that was working and now we're changing it? Why?
Often. I mean, I think that as I look back, if you had a scale of, like dysfunction to strategic, and you look at the executive level decisions, mostly board level decisions, initially until, I don't know, maybe the 2012, 2015, the board was very political, right?
True.
I mean, David Dukakis was on the board. The guy ran for president, and he's going to be on the board.
The Texas Eagle Heartland Flyer, by that time, local revenue management team, made 2 presentations to the board of directors at Amtrak at official board meetings. And I remember I remember being there and doing my part of that presentation and looking out and thinking, how did I ever get to a point where I'm speaking to Michael
Yeah.
Dukakis?
Michael Dukakis. Yeah, I was there. It was in Texas. I remember. Where was it? Where was it?
No, Dukakis, where Dukakis was, that's when Tommy Thompson was board chairman. We made that presentation in DC.
Okay.
The other
But I remember
presentation
you.
was in Atlanta, Georgia.
Okay. Yeah, but let's just look at when I joined the SBU thing, right? So they say Amtrak is too, all the decisions are being made in Washington. They have no idea who their customers are. So let's create 3 SBUs. And the Mercer big study of Mercer, right?
Yeah, may I point out, I know very little about the Mercer report, but I mean, I'm not qualified in all of its semantics and inferences, but that's how we got, ladies and gentlemen, the successful, to this day, Longview Houston throughway bus was from the Mercer report.
Good to hear there was some value in that,
Yep.
But they recommended, first of all, the SBUs. And so by the time we got to long distance, when I went to Chicago, the everyone who was there was a buyout. So a lot of good employees left, 94, 95. Northeast Corridor was created first, right? George Warrington grabbed all the good people. Then the California system was done next. And so by the time long distance came around, I wasn't responsible for pricing, right? There was nothing. No one gave me anything. I looked at the pricing sheet. There was no computer. There was no folder, no files. There was no person who worked in pricing before. They were all gone. So I started from scratch. And, it was, the long distance was just kind of an afterthought. It was put together last. And, good news is that Mark came along, and he was one of the good decisions because he was a business person. He knew how to run a business, right? But you can see that there were decisions that have been made along the way that, were just politically motivated. I mean, I can remember when George Warrington, well, actually, to finish the Mercer study and the whole SBU, is they went to tri-weekly service, right? So they took all of the long distance trains, and I think the Builder was 4 days a week, the Pioneer was 3 days a week. And there was, I was just kind of doing some research this last week, and I came across a Trains article where Tom Downs was interviewed in 2001. And he'd said, we knew it wasn't going to work. He said, we did the analysis and we knew that it would lose money. Mercer was saying clawback. If there's 100 people on the train going from, Denver to San Francisco, that's 700 a week. And so if you run it 4 days a week, you now have, the number of people per train is higher. You'll claw back those people. Well, guess what happened? The person who wanted to go from Denver to Salt Lake City on Wednesday and come back on Saturday, well, there wasn't a train coming back on Saturday. So they flew. It was just the opposite of clawback. So that's just a perfect example. And then they went on to say that the getting rid of the Desert Wind and the Pioneer and what was supposed to happen with the Texas Eagle was a sacrifice to Congress. It was like, we're going to go back to daily service, but we're going to get rid of these 3 trains. And then, of course, in steps you and Joy and Dr. Pollard and Kay Bailey Hutchinson and,
Well,
George.
let's start with Kay Bailey Hutchinson and then go down. Yes. Yeah, it's this simple, and I have said this in previous podcasts, sir. Just my very humble and respectful personal opinion of observation for 5 decades. But every now and then, Amtrak forgets who owns it, meaning you and I and the rest of everybody out there. And what I've seen the 3 or 4 times I've seen that happen in the last 5 decades, that rubber band gets awfully tight and then it snaps back.
Mhm.
And every time, the 3 or 4 times it happened, corporate Amtrak seems to be the last. What happened here? What happened? And it's to me, it's this simple. It's your 8th grade civics lesson at work. The people that own you have said you're not being responsive to us.
Yeah.
And that rubber band, and just my humble opinion, what do I know? But that rubber band is awfully tight in 2023 and getting tighter in 2024. It'll be interesting to see how this flushes out. But I want to digress 1 second to what the wonderful, iconic, and I know you agree with me, Joy Spencer Smith, who's just had her fingers in every part of this corporation at one time or another. But here's what she said about clawback. And she's the first to admit she's not an operating person, like somebody who came up through the operating ranks on the railroad. She came up through the service ranks. But she's absolutely right. She said clawback didn't work for the simple reason that 100% right. Boy, she hit this nail right on the head. It's as simple as the railroad dispatcher from the freight carriers came to work. Well, now, wait a minute. Is it Monday or is it Tuesday? Is Amtrak operating today or is Amtrak operating? And then the mindset finally becomes, well, screw it. If they don't care what days they run, we don't care what days they run, And I think it did adversely affect on-time performance, from which we never recovered.
Well, that's a great point. I never realized.
Yeah, that's a Joy Smith observation, and I think she's absolutely right.
Yeah.
That's the freight carriers were not always exactly our best friends to begin with sometimes, but after the Mercer report, it really was obvious. Well, if Amtrak doesn't care, what days they run, well, how are we supposed to keep up with it? I think it gave them an excuse. Is just my observation.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so tell me about the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. And you were in finance by that time. Were you what was your title at 2007 to 2009? Vice President of Finance, Assistant Vice President?
No, I think I think they were still using the word chief.
Chief.
Yeah.
Okay. And what were you tasked to do in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009? And by the way, may I just add this footnote? Just last year, to show you how widespread and viable that program must have been, just last year did the final monies get spent at Longview, Texas, with a new platform that were appropriated under that act.
Yeah.
And the sign said, American Recovery and Reinvestment Project of 2009. The sign said that when we cut the ribbon in 2022.
Yeah, well, I mean, for those that don't know, this was the Obama Act that took place right after he, the year after he came into office, and the economy was really struggling. I mean, it was, the whole real estate crash, et cetera. So it was about spending money to get people working. And so a number of states, the federal government through the FRA was offering billions of dollars to states, and states had to put up maybe 20%. In some cases, I'm not even sure they had to put up 20% of the cost. And the federal government was going to do the rest. And there was never any kind of project, national project like that in the past. So the initial allocation there might have been 30, 20, I think we had 30 applications. So what I was overseeing was identifying the operating costs for the train, because you have to put together the revenue side, which is what George Reid was doing, the revenue forecast for these changes in service and new services. And then I was doing the operating costs with the people who were working with me. And so we'd figure out what would happen when we started operating the train. What would they have to pay for equipment? What would they have to pay the host railroad? What would they have to pay for fuel? What would all the costs be to determine what the operating loss is, because as you know, every long distance train loses money, and the state would have to pay that. But basically, the federal government was going to give them all the capital that is needed. So it was already allocated. They picked the states, and we had to field about 30 of these applications to determine what the operating cost is, so then the state would know how much they would have to pay each year for the service.
I'm going to take a guess here. Again, this is another example of you're way up here and I'm way down here. But I would think it must have been terribly, terribly difficult to find the true operating costs of a particular train, because there's so many tentacles there. Or what was it simple? Am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong. I think the fact is that, first of all, I had two really good people working for me, Paul Gowald and Kevin Hammond. And Paul was great at getting data, and Kevin was good at just, putting together processes, because we had to do 30 of these. We usually did 4 or 5 a year, and all of a sudden we had 6 months to do 30 of them. But it's all about, you have estimates per mile. So, the cost for the equipment so the equipment might be a per day estimate. Fuel would be per mile, but the labor costs, et cetera. So you just break it down into ratios that apply to similar trains.
Oh,
and so,
okay.
It's directionally accurate kind of stuff. If you say you're going to lose 12 million and they lose 13 and a half, no one's going to come to me and say you screwed up. Or if, it turns out that they lost 9 instead of 12. But, a lot of it had to do with just getting don't let the perfect get in the way of the good. We needed to get these out so the states could make decisions as to whether or not they wanted to sign up for them.
Okay. So, were those awarded by the FRA? I
Yeah.
mean, you did the analysis, then the FRA took your analysis and awarded those.
That's correct. The state would then turn in an application to the FRA. So we would work with the state, and we would put together the revenue forecast and the operating cost forecast, and then the state would fill out a form or present an application to the FRA, and then the FRA decided.
Could this have been for any Amtrak train, or just the short haul, less than 450-mile Amtrak trains?
It was the short haul. I mean, the FRA restrictions this was for the states. These were all going to be state funded service. So none of this, initially, none of the ERA money was to go to Amtrak.
Okay, you brought up something that I have never heard, which is one of the purposes of this podcast, to get to the historical facts. So unless I misheard now, which is possible, but so the intention of the federal government was to reimburse the states for this money. So state legislatures would not have to go meet and actually allocate money to operate Amtrak trains. That money would be coming from Washington.
No, it was the capital money was going to come. So Illinois did a lot in the early 2000s. Virginia has done a lot where they negotiate with the host railroad, and they put in all kinds. They give the host railroad tens of millions of dollars so that they can have access to add service. And so the federal government was basically saying, we're going to pay the host railroads for whatever changes they have to make to their routes so these trains can operate. And those are huge hurdles that states have to clear to add service. And so the federal government was stepping in with hundreds. I don't know how big the number was. I didn't look it up, but this included the high-speed rail California project, which is still slowly limping along. Right. And there was a high-speed rail section in Florida that Florida ended up turning down. So, one of the things that I was going to say that I think is important to also include is that 3 states turned the money down. They put it in, they put an application, they they got tens of millions of dollars authorized, and then the governors or the state legislatures, but in some ways I think it was the governors, just said, we don't want this because we don't want to pay the yearly operating losses. So the high-speed rail section in Florida that was going to be in northern Florida was turned down by the state of Florida. The Ohio 3Cs, the Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, that was a great service. I remember putting that together. There was a schedule of like 4 round trips a day, and it really was a good schedule for all 3 cities. And they're talking about it now. But the governor turned that down. In Wisconsin, there was going to be a train that went to Madison, from Milwaukee. And again, they said, no, we don't want to have to pay. Maybe it was 3 million, maybe it was 5 million or 7 million a year to pay the operating loss. We don't want to do that. And, the citizens of those states lost out because, the Ohio is a perfect example. There would be train service now between Cleveland and Columbus and Cincinnati, and there would be at least 4 departures a day, and they probably would have started operating, before 2010. Who knows how long it would take to implement, but Illinois took that money and they added a lot of frequency. Virginia took the money and they added frequency. Washington State took money and they added frequency. But those 3 states decided that they didn't want it. The governors decided they didn't want it.
So the 3 states were Florida, Ohio, and Wisconsin.
Right.
That turned down the money. Classic examples, I would think, of what Winston Churchill once said about America, and that is Americans generally get it right after they try everything else that doesn't work first. So this might be a case of that adage coming true. How I should know the answer to this, but I don't. How come my home state of Texas didn't get any money? Did they not apply originally? Is that why?
Correct. Yeah,
Okay.
The state
So
had
they
to
just
apply for the money. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I mean, involved in the planning, in the teens and, and through today, I'm sure. Talk about Houston, Dallas, what, number 3rd largest city, 4th largest city in the country, both, the 2 of them, and no train service between the 2. There should be high-speed train. And I know there's a company, there's talk about it, they're dancing around it, but it's still, years away. And, that's a perfect example of where, and I know Stephen Gardner's, have been trying to do things there to make it work and to be part of it. But that's certainly an area where, and certainly the better service between Dallas, Fort Worth, and San Antonio through Austin would also be great. Those are opportunities that are still out there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's for me at least. It's as simple as this. I won't belabor a point because I've also said this in another podcast, but when the Downs plan was to eliminate the Desert Wind, the Pioneer, and the Texas Eagle, that in 1997, I believe that was announced maybe in the fall of 96, but it was a process that played out during fiscal 1997. Those of us who had been down here and in the good fight for any length of time, with all respect, and there's no arrogance meant here in any way, shape, form, or fashion, but we all knew from day one. We didn't know about the Desert Wind or the Pioneer, but from day one, you had a Texas Eagle, a train which served 5 of the 10 largest cities in the United States. So from day one, we all knew this grassroots fight is going to be easy to organize. And it was. I didn't say the fight was easy, but it was easy to get organized because you have 5 of the 10 largest cities in the U.S.
Yeah.
all served by one train. And I think sometimes corporately, maybe Amtrak doesn't think of in very brief repetition, eighth grade civics lesson at work. Who owns you? Who's really calling the shots here? Every now and then Amtrak has to get reminded. So, sir, you took over market research in 2011. Now that was for the whole nation.
Yes.
Okay, and what did that like? Let me ask a weeds question. Like, did that include things like Little Rock to Dallas, or did it just include Chicago to San Antonio? Did you just look at the macro picture, or did it include everything?
I think initially, well, I think on the most part, it's pretty macro. We initially, the research was primarily, we do the focus groups for the marketing department, for the advertising campaigns to help figure out what resonates with our customers, focus groups on, changes to service, food service. We try different foods and talk to people about what they thought. And then we would also do various research on demand in new markets, but it evolved, and this kind of jumps to the last few years that I was at Amtrak, was we changed the vendor to do our satisfaction surveys. So obviously an important thing was the monthly satisfaction, and you remember those reports where for each route we would have a whole bunch of questions that we would ask customers about, what they thought about on-time performance and what they thought about the food service and, station experience, et cetera. And, it's interesting, when Richard Anderson came in, he got a letter from somebody that said, Amtrak's market research is screwing this up because they're only talking to 5% of the customers. And so how do they know what the customers really want? And so Richard Anderson got this letter and he wrote, good question, and he circled some things and he forwarded it to me and said, let's have a meeting to talk about this. And of course, I had heard that people who had gone into a meeting with Richard walked out kind of a little shell-shocked because he knew the business and he knew what he was talking about. So obviously I prepared a lot, but basically went in and said, this guy who wrote to the email didn't know what he was talking about, because we can do market research on presidential polls, and if they had to, they survey, you get to the point where you're surveying 5,000-6,000 people, it will reflect. And so I remember Richard said to me, so you're telling me I'm wrong? And I said, well, yeah, kind of. And I think it was just a test, but he then did things for us. He spent a lot of money on equipment, but he also spent a lot of money in IT. And so he created a customer database that took a year plus to build. But by the time we were about a year, 6 months to a year before COVID hit, we had this database of 30 million customers. If you think about it, Amtrak customers give us their email addresses, they give us their phone numbers when they make the reservation, right?
That's more than our annual national ridership.
Yeah. Oh, it was probably more than that, because
Yeah.
it was more than 30 million, because we have this information from just about everyone who rides a train, right? And so we then worked with a new agency, and right before COVID hit, we were able to send out emails to do very customized surveys for a large number of people. And we were just paying this company by the month. We weren't paying them by the survey. And so when COVID hit, we went down to 5% year over year business. So, instead of if there was 10,000 people who traveled the year before on that day, there were what, 500 people or 50 people, 5%. And so we were able to each month send emails out to customers, and even demographically, not so much demographically, but based on where they traveled and how frequently they traveled, we could customize these surveys and find out what they thought about taking the train and when they were going to come back. And we established certain questions that we used to gauge their interest in coming back. And of course, that was really important for the Northeast Corridor, but it was important for long distance trains. And so that was kind of my last project at Amtrak. And it was really a really great project to be able to do. And it was because Richard Anderson came in to Amtrak with all this experience from Delta. So, my appreciation, when I think about executive decisions that are, less than optimal versus very strategic, hiring Richard Anderson was very strategic from my perspective, because I saw what he did. He brought in really professional people. Roger Harris, who's now president, I worked for Roger, and, he came from Mexican Airlines. And before that, I mean, he knew revenue management, he knew airlines, and he learned Amtrak. And, there's just a whole bunch of other people that Richard brought in. And we almost broke even. The year before COVID, Amtrak lost like 125 million. 6 years before that, we were losing 800 million. And it wasn't just Richard, it was a lot of good people. Mark Murphy did great things in long distance train and cutting back with Joy, cutting back costs there. And so there's a lot of good progress was made, but Richard just took us so close to that goal line with the people that he brought in. So anyway, I'm doing kind of a ramble here about, the market research and what I was doing, but a lot of what Amtrak is today, I think, is in a much stronger position because they're running it like a company. They're not running it like a political operation, or at least the board is hiring based on the ability to manage, not on the basis of some political agenda, from my perspective.
So is it correct to say then that Amtrak is recovering from the fare box its operating expenses?
I saw something this week that I think Roger Harris said that they're still probably 3 or 4 years away from getting back to where they could get close to break even on operations, because COVID really hurt.
Right.
Because and again, I left in 21, in March of 21. And so when I left, we were probably at 27-30% of the year before, of the pre-COVID numbers or something like that. So we were still a long ways away. So, and I don't know how close they are, but I think that it's going to take some time, just because people aren't traveling, especially in the Northeast Corridor, at the frequency that they used to, because business travel is still down, I suspect.
I looked this up not long ago in some notes that I had kept from many years ago. When I first joined Amtrak in 1974, the cost to recovery relationship was 23%. And when I left in 2020, I believe it was in the 90 percentile range, cost to recovery. And when you look upon it over that 5 decades, that's pretty remarkable recovery.
Oh, yeah.
That's 70 points.
Sure. Yeah. And at that time, right before COVID, Acela was like 175%. And,
wow. Okay.
And Northeast Regional was like 150. Again, directionally accurate statistics, not specifically accurate probably, but those two were the two that were over 100%. And they were carrying the weight of a lot of trains and a lot of the long distance trains. I mean, there were 2 or 3 long distance trains that were losing 50 million a year. California Zephyr and Empire Builder. And,
That's
that's a
right.
lot of money, but as a whole, they got real close to that 100% in 2019, and our budget was 100% for 2020, and we were on budget before COVID hit. So I think we would have done it.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So COVID really is the culprit there
Yeah,
on,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Sir, let me throw out some thoughts to you here just to get your uh, gut level opinion on it. What did you feel about the firing of David Gunn?
Oh, it was foolish. Yeah, big mistake. Two reasons. Uh, David did a great job in just bringing the pride of operations back and respecting the people who work there, and and again, I was in marketing, so I saw this peripherally. I mean, David Gunn at one point uh, came to me after being there for probably 6 or 8 months, not knowing what revenue management was. I think Matt Hardison told me that he went into David's office one time and David said, "What's this department? I got like 23 people working in this revenue management. What do they do?" And so he orchestrated or directed a reduction in force, and I had to let some people go. But he is a great guy, but he was a great boss, and he did great things. And yeah, he said some things in Congress that pissed off the board, on the Hill, and they fired him. So what happened? Alex Kumont. Who's Alex Kumont? They couldn't find anyone to replace him. It's like, if you were capable of doing the job as a CEO of Amtrak and they fired David Gunn, would you take the job? If you fire David Gunn, why would I think I'm going to be able to do a job there? So I feel sorry for Alex Kumar, because basically he was the only guy that would say yes that had any close to experience of doing it. So anyway, I think at two fronts, I think it was a big mistake.
Thank you for saying that out loud, because I was just going to say from my level, uh, and we had the opportunity to get to know Mr. Kumont fairly well because we celebrated the 10th anniversary of the Tempo Group, the Texas Eagle Marketing and Performance Organization, under his presidency. And we had the chairman of the board of Amtrak. We all came to Marshall, Texas, the birthplace of Tempo, and had this big 20-year celebration, which lasted all weekend. And he was there, and that's how kind of we all felt sorry for him. It's like, wow, he he's got a lot going on. You know, it was apparent that he was going to have to be a quick study, but he didn't last long, I don't think.
No, he lasted 2 years, but I was really surprised. I think that was probably the beginning of the transformation of the board, because I don't have the years in front of me, but the 2 years that he was there were good years at Amtrak. We had record ridership growth, and I kept on thinking,
We did.
oh, we are stuck with him for a couple more years, because, and I was still very peripheral, but I would see Kumant every now and then, and, he just didn't, it just wasn't a place for him. He was very dependent on people who reported to him. But the board let him go after the second year, and that was really helpful, because after him, it was then I'm trying to I sometimes I get really confused with names, but Joe Boardman, right?
Right.
And Joe Boardman was certainly better than Kumant.
Didn't am I remembering correctly? Didn't Mr. Kumant have Union Pacific executive heritage? Hadn't he been a UP vice president? I think he
I think
had
so.
been.
Yeah, I think that's right.
You've already discussed him a little bit, but I just wanted to throw out the name Richard Anderson and get your thoughts there. But I want to say something. Were you aware? And I can't remember. I'm low tech, and the whole world, including Amtrak, is high tech. So I'm sure this came out over the computer in a wire or email or something, and not in a letter. I wish I had saved it, and maybe I did. Maybe I have this in some box of junk somewhere. But Mr. Anderson actually put out a statement to all employees that it was a negative thing to have passion about your job. And do you remember that?
No, I don't.
It
No.
was really a low blow to all of us. Like, really?
Yeah.
But he did. He did do that. So if you don't remember it, then you don't have an impression of it. So moving on from that thought, what did you think about Richard Anderson? I know you've already told us some, but who who was the man that you saw every day in the corporate setting? Who was the man you passed in the hallway?
He was very personable. And I think, I was fortunate, I think, to be able to have the experience that I already described with him because, he respected me and the work that I did. So I can remember, every year we would set the goal for the customer service rate, the customer service score. 50% of our bonus was tied to that, right? And the second year he was there, I had been in a couple meetings and was doing an analysis to try to figure out, what would be a reasonable target for the score. And somebody came to me and said, "Oh, Richard said the goal should be X." And I can't remember what the number was, right?
Okay.
And so I went directly to his office and, asked if I could come in, and I told him, "Hey, you're wrong. We're not going to make that number. That number is not possible." And so he said, "Well, what do you think the number should be?" And I told him, and that was the number. And that turned out to be the number for 21 when I left. But no, I really liked the guy. I really thought from a business standpoint, he brought in really smart people, right? And so I know that he came in with a reputation where he, was anti-labor and had overseen the Delta bankruptcy, which hurt a lot of the employees there. And for peripherally, I don't know, and I'd like to know what you think of him from a labor management standpoint. But I get on the elevator with him, and he was very personable with me and friendly, and asked how I was doing. And I really have a lot of respect for him. I think that I think he really made a difference in taking Amtrak to a much higher level of financial performance. And if it wasn't for COVID, I think that would have been really important because we were to the point where we were breaking even operationally. And he spent a lot of money on cars and equipment, and everyone else, after the Acela equipment, everyone says, "Oh, well, we can't buy any more equipment for years." And he said, "That's crazy. Let's just go out and buy more equipment." And he did, so I think he really came in and opened the eyes of the company to things that they didn't realize they could do.
So when you're an insider like you were in the corporate atmosphere, everybody's on a first name basis. You call the president Richard. He
Yeah, I
calls
did.
you Bill. I mean,
Griff, how often have I told you, please don't call me sir?
well, but how often have I told you? My mother, who you knew, who lived to be 91, she said if she knew that I was still standing up when a lady entered the room or calling people yes sir and no sir at age 60, she wouldn't have ingrained it in me the way she did. I can't. You're asking me to go against childhood heritage. I'll try, Bill, but it's really difficult. I mean, you laugh, but it's difficult. Here's this is not the purpose of this podcast, but here's what you got when you were a kid. And you get that every time you don't say it, it sticks with you. So but anyway, so the corporate setting, I guess for people that don't know, like me, the corporate setting, the day-to-day life in the corporate setting was familial like it is in stations or onboard service. I mean, it's all big one. Okay.
No, it depends on the person. I mean, as I think about it, I'm sure I called him Mr. Anderson for the first year. At some point, I don't think he ever said you can call me Richard, but at some point I felt like I could.
Got it.
But you know, I never called Mr. Boardman anything but Mr. Boardman. So it's the individual.
Yeah, I would doubt. I could be wrong, and this is, I know it's before your time, but just immediately before your time, I doubt if anybody called Mr. Clater Graham in the corporate setting. I bet it was always Mr. Clater.
Yeah.
Sir, you've been very gracious to give us some larger than life memorable experiences. One of which we share. Did you know the man that I worked directly for 25 years, Neil Wright, who became R.N. Wright? Well, he was my immediate boss for 25 years. And, he became the vice president of passenger services for American Orient Express.
Oh.
So consequently, I got to ride the AOE several times. So I see, and what I see, we have that in common. Where wasn't it it was quite an experience. Where did you travel?
Went from Washington to New Orleans.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So you had, wow. Did you did they have stopovers for historic tours in like in Atlanta? And yeah.
Monticello, stopped in Virginia, of course the train sits and waits for you, and we go to do a tour and come back. And yeah, what happened was when I was in pricing in Chicago, Mary Nazaro, who was responsible for the marketing department, said that American Orient Express wants to put their cars on the back of Amtrak in the wintertime. So, we need your help to figure out what the pricing would be. And so I said, well, how can I price something if I haven't experienced it?
Right. Right.
So
but, see, my kind of guy. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. My kind of guy.
So Carol, my wife, and my daughter Kate and I flew to Washington, and started with us getting on the train with a small band playing music as we're walking Union Station to get on the train. And it was, as just so luxurious and old and wonderful, and one seating for food. And probably the first time my daughter, who was probably 7 at the time, had venison and ate it. And of course, then the other fun story is that they have a grand piano, and they had a guy playing the piano, and we're coming back from dinner, and he's playing Mary. It was like probably Sound of Music song. And so my daughter just walked over there and started singing, and he played 2 or 3 songs. And my wife wouldn't be happy if I said this, which of course she'll watch this, but I'll get in trouble. But I was the second youngest person on that train, where my daughter was the youngest.
I can identify with that. The years that I did, one of my favorite AOE stories that I'd like to put on the historical record, and I had not even thought of this, but this was not. This was one of the times when it was running with Amtrak engines, but its own separate train. We were not on the rear end of the Texas Eagle. And Neil I don't know where they were going, but Neil invited me to ride with him from Longview to Texarkana, which had been Neil's old territory, and my current working territory. But the American Orient Express wasn't scheduled to stop. It was running nonstop from Dallas to Texarkana. And it was in hot August time of the year. And like any good Southern boy, I've got a solid white suit. You get a Southern boy my age has to have, and somewhere he's got a solid white suit pushed back in the closet. So I put on my solid white suit, and I went down to the depot, and here's all it wasn't anywhere near Amtrak train time, but here all of my old cronies, railroad guys standing around on the platform, the car people on it. And all of a sudden the American Orient Express comes to a stop, the vestibule trap door opens, and me in my white suit gets on, and off we go. And I was the talk of the town for about a week there after that. It's like, wow, who does he know? Well, the bottom line is when you know the vice president of passenger services, stuff like that is easy.
Yeah, there you go.
But Neil, I'm sorry you didn't know Neil. He was a wonderful man, a Santa Fe man, Santa Fe heritage, and they knew how to run passenger trains. I have to ask about this, something that you listed, because Dr. Bill Pollard will just be gratified to hear some of your memorable train experiences were to and from Tempo trips. Thank you for remembering the Tempo group and for putting that down. That's great.
Yeah, I can, one trip, I think the meeting was in San Antonio, and probably was my first trip, and went through Dallas, Fort Worth, got behind schedule, but left Fort Worth, and actually got a ride in the front end. That was pretty cool. I can't remember. Someone arranged that. So I rode in the front end from San Antonio to maybe to Austin or someone before Austin. And from Fort Worth to Austin.
Probably Tim Cooper, the operating superintendent who arranged that.
Yeah. And then I remember we got well behind, and then we stopped, and there was a bunch of us. There was like 10, 12, 14 people from Amtrak going to this meeting. And somebody said, oh, let's go there's a great restaurant over there. And so I remember walking over, leaving the train thinking, can we do this? And, going into this great restaurant that was, probably
Meteoras.
Yeah.
The name of it.
Meteoras, exactly. Yeah. And, I don't think we ate there. I think we brought the food back, but I was just kind of amazed that we could just walk away from a train and know that they wouldn't leave without us.
Right.
So that was fun. The other one I remember is I think it was in Palm Springs. And so,
Yes.
Took
when
the
Richard
Texas
hosted.
Eagle. Yeah, I took the Texas Eagle towards there. No, yeah, I did. And then after the meeting, I was taking the Southwest Chief home and pulled into Albuquerque. And we were early, and the conductor announced that, we're going to be leaving at 1 o'clock. And I remember going out to the vendors who were selling the wonderful Indian stuff and saying, where's a good Mexican restaurant? And they said, oh, you need to go to Garcia's. And, that's about a 10-minute taxi ride from here. And so I remember going over to the conductor, and I says, I just want to make sure I got this straight. I have till 1:30 before you're leaving, and it was like 12 o'clock or something. I had over an hour. But I remember going with trepidation, getting in a cab and going to Garcia's and getting some probably cheese enchiladas or something, and then coming back and getting on the train and, like eating half of it before the train left. But I always thought that was a benefit of sometimes having a train that arrives early and is scheduled to leave later, where you can just literally go to the nice restaurant and come back with food.
Indeed.
And then the last thing on that same trip, sorry to interrupt.
Sure. No, please.
I was walking through the coach, just kind of seeing what's going on, and I heard this wonderful music. I went down into the smoking car, because remember, we used to have the smoking rooms in those cars, right? And there was a guy playing the cello. And there was about 10 people listening. And so I went in and listened too. He was just amazing, like Yo-Yo Ma level cello player.
Wow.
And, maybe for about 15 minutes. And then I talked with him briefly, and he had just signed. He was going for his first day of work with, I think it was the Chicago Symphony, but you meet so many interesting people on trains, but I thought that was kind of fun to just, here's some guy who's just joined the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and he's playing his cello in the smoking room, of all places, on the train.
Where else but Amtrak?
Yeah.
Sir, tell us about the private car on the Lakeshore Limited that turned into a lifelong friendship? What
Oh,
private
yeah.
can you name names? What private car was
Sure.
it?
Yeah. Tyler Robbins. So Kate and Carol and I, again, Kate was, probably the same age, pretty close. We went to New York for vacation, lived in Chicago, came back on the Lakeshore. And so we pulled into Albany, and I thought, let's get out. We want to see, I want to see them attach the train from Boston, you know? So we're out and just kind of hanging out. And then I look and there's a private car on the back. So I go over and I'm just kind of looking at it. The three of us are just looking at it. And, this guy comes over and he starts talking. And at that point, he didn't know I worked for Amtrak. But I, probably said some things that made it sound like I knew what I was talking about. And I said, "Oh, that's a beautiful car." He says, "Oh, why don't you come aboard?" So we get on the back with the little balcony on the back of the train, and we get in, and it was a, beautiful dining room. And they had just finished dinner, and they were going to have cheesecake for dessert. And he says, "Yeah, why don't you join us?" So, train
Wow.
starts moving, and we're eating cheesecake with them. And then they give us a tour of the car. And then we're telling them that, we're in a sleeper. And so then we gave them a tour of the Viewliner Deluxe room that we were in. And we became friends, and, I would see him in Chicago every now and then. And he kept his car in Toledo, I think. And he'd come to Washington usually once a year. And he'd always have me for dinner, Carol and I for dinner. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, it was a lot of fun. And he always used to call me up and he'd say, "Bill, this is your second best friend in the world," or something like that. He was a real funny guy. And he did always want something from me. He wanted a name, or, I want to park my car here. Who should I talk to? And that kind of thing. But still a good guy, obviously.
Uh-oh, now I'm getting embarrassed. That sounds like Griff Hubbard. I don't think I ever called you unless I needed something or wanted something. Even though I probably didn't admit to it, I probably called to say hi, but there was a motive back there somewhere. What a wonderful, wonderful story. And you keep up with each other to this day.
No, I haven't, and I just had to go through my old computer yesterday to make sure I remembered his name correctly, but I have an email address, so I'll send him an email and see how.
There you go. See, there you go. Sir, what and Mr. Gunn has very graciously agreed to appear on this podcast. But from your perspective, what happened? And I don't want to steal Mr. Gunn's thunder. And the reason this is not a setup question, I give you my word as a gentleman, from my perspective and my level of where I operated, we never knew what happened to Mail Baggage and Express. And again, I'm going to be able to ask what happened.
I think that he just came in and said, "We're not in that business." I think, and in fact, it's kind of interesting. I was looking at Wikipedia, so I'm preparing for this conversation, and I want to make sure I get names right, and couldn't remember some names and some, and it's interesting to look at the history of Amtrak on Wikipedia. And the first thing that hit me was that there was nothing in there about tri-weekly service and the whole SBU thing.
Wow. Okay.
But they did comment a little bit about the Package Express, or whatever they called it at the time. And I'm trying to remember the train. It was like Lake County Limited or something like that.
Lake Country, I think.
Yeah, Lake Country Limited. And that was kind of the poster child of ridiculous routes for some of us. And it even said in Train Magazine, I think is where I looked it up, they said that, it averaged 0 to 10 riders per trip. And it basically was built to haul as I recall, someone told me cranberry juice, so we put cranberry juice on the back of the train with one coach, and it went back and forth every day on a really weird schedule.
Well,
And
for the
that was,
benefit of our viewers, sir, where did it travel to and from the Lake Country Limited?
it traveled into Chicago. They built a freight handling operation, in Union Station to move all this freight around. I don't even, somewhere in Wisconsin. It was not Madison, it was not Milwaukee, it was some small city that. But anyway, I think that David came in and said, "This is not our business," and so it was interesting when Warrington was president and CEO. The year I left to do the consulting, they put a budget together where they to justify what this glide path to financial stability, which was Warrington's kind of theme with Congress, they put together a budget that included a significant amount of revenue from this, express service that hadn't even been approved yet. And it was in the budget, and obviously the revenue didn't come in, and they missed the budget by far that year.
Remember, we printed a route map with those lines on it without giving the freight carriers a heads up. Yes. So you're saying that turned out to be a negative experience in terms of where you sat?
Very much so. I mean, again, I wasn't in finance then. That was early on, and in fact, the 2 years I left was when it was in operation. So, but from what I heard, no, it didn't. The thing that I think really frustrated David Gunn, and you'll ask him, is that nobody knew what the actual financial benefit of it was, because the finance department didn't quite figure out how much it cost and how much, what was the incremental cost to run these trains, because, they were allocating a lot of costs that were fixed to these trains that if they went away, those fixed costs would stay. So I'm really not the right person to ask about that. I was very peripheral to it.
Yeah, we just never knew. I was peripherally involved with. Remember, we did I hope I have the name right here. I could be wrong. I believe it was Mr. Walton, Al Walton, who went around the nation, country, seeing how many street crossings we would block, hauling additional mail, baggage, and express. And I just remember assisting with some report, or I don't really remember, but I was assisting somehow. It was the unusual effect that at Texarkana, Marshall, and Longview, there were no road crossings within a mile either side of the depot. So we had no, it was just, I remember it being an unusual thing. You had 3 stations in a row, Texarkana, Marshall, Longview, no problem. You can't block anything. And then I just remember everybody thinking what a good thing that was. And then the next thing we knew, poof, there wasn't anything. So
I think probably because financially they really weren't accurately reporting the impact, but David Gunn probably would know better.
Got it. Sir, last thing as we come to conclusions here, and thank you for your gracious time and your sincere input into this historical podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask every guest for a railroad secret. And what I mean by that is what's going to be lost to history if we don't tell it today. And very few podcast guests have anything that they want to contribute. But our friend, Mr. Bill Sheridan, has something. And it's so wonderful, I have to know the details. Now, if you ask me how many times Joy Smith kept me from getting fired, it'd be an easy answer. I could just start naming them off, but I don't have this one. Tell us about the time David Gunn, the president of the company, kept you from getting fired. What do you have to tell us that story?
Yeah, well, when I came back to Amtrak in 2000, the chief information officer, the head IT guy, I can't remember his name, but he had negotiated a contract with Sabre for a new revenue management system. And so revenue management systems then probably cost about $5 million, and they didn't want to spend $5 million. So he negotiated a price, something significantly less, and then Amtrak would pay Sabre over a certain number of years, like 50 cents a transaction or something, that would give them the equivalent of the 5 million based on the use of this system. So I came in, and that contract had already been signed and they were working on the system. So I then became involved in, the design of it, testing, et cetera. And so that was right about the time that David Gunn came in, and I already said, he then looked at his discovered revenue management was about and asked about it. And the person that I was reporting to started looking into this system and didn't like what he saw. And so then I was involved in a couple of meetings with the representative from Sabre and with my boss trying to figure out if this system would work and how it would work. And he got more and more disappointed. And then at some point I was no longer invited to the meetings. And so he ended up negotiating a settlement with Sabre, and I think it was like $2 or $3 million that Amtrak had to pay them to go away. And so there was no revenue management system, and we had to pay an additional $2.5 million. And so I could obviously feel the tension. And I had a couple meetings with David Gunn, and the joke I tell people is that I think what really saved me was that the meeting that I had with David Gunn, and this is really more a joke than truth, or maybe it's partially true, is that I wore this train tie to the meeting. So it was this, it was a little over the top with pictures of trains on it. And he came to my office, and I had some books about trains, and but I think also I interacted with David in a way that I guess got his attention. But I found out later, years later, that my boss was going to fire me, and David said, I think he's worth keeping. So that's the story I heard.
Wow. Who was your boss at that time? Do you mind saying, or would you rather not?
I'm not going to say that. No.
Understood. Okay, but you have it on pretty good authority. He was going to do that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you haven't already talked to him, you can ask him. And if not, I had just heard that. And I mean, if I was in the position of my boss, I probably would have done the same thing. Because, admittedly, I probably didn't do a good enough job of explaining that I was not part of this decision. But certainly, reaching out and signing a contract and paying, let's say, $1 million up front, and then having to pay $2.5 million to get out of this contract that would have forced Amtrak to pay 50 cents a transaction for 5 years or something, that would be a reason to really kind of question whether or not who's ever in charge of this should be around. So I don't blame him, but again, it wasn't my deal.
You really piqued my interest here at the end of our time together. This had to have been it, I guess. At that time, I was one of your revenue managers, and we were required monthly. And in fact, part of this was being developed in Paris, France, was it not? Does that ring a bell? This Sabre system, part of that team?
Yeah.
because I know this is going to sound crazy, but truth is stranger than fiction. The Point Sabre person in Paris, France, developing this system, grew up in my hometown of Texarkana, Texas. I know the world's a small
Wow.
place,
Yeah.
but everybody was providing him this information, not just me, but every month we were required to report into him operating anomalies of the
Oh, wow.
Texas Eagle so that could be built into this system.
Hmm.
And I still have all those notes, because if there was a service, anything that we were required to keep it and to submit it to this guy. His last name was Jones, Mr. Jones. But the bottom line here, I'm glad it didn't come to pass. It made no sense to me from the standpoint you're going to build service anomalies into a revenue management system, which may or may not happen next year.
Right.
Just because we bust from Fort Worth to El Paso today, we may not be doing it a year from today. So I'm glad. We all took a big sigh of relief when that system did not go online. However, I want you to know, still hanging in my garage today in Longview, Texas, I have a big orange saber ball sent to me from Mr. Jones to keep me from running into the wall of my garage when I park my car. Big red, and that's where that came from those years. Sir, what have I left? What have I left out? Anything that you want to talk about to say? Because, like I say, this is your story, and I'm grateful you're telling it. But don't let me tell it. Anything I haven't asked that I should have?
No, I think you've been very thorough. I'm, amazed that the conversation has gone on as long as it has. But it's been a pleasure to spend this time and talk with you about it.
Well, I have always very gratefully considered you a friend. And I'm going to repeat this on purpose. You were magnanimous and kind, even when you didn't have to be. And on behalf of Jesse Padilla and Dr. Bill Pollard and myself, you are the only high-level Amtrak manager. I'm not saying somebody else didn't do it, but you were the only high-level Amtrak official who ever said to the three of us, "You're doing a good job." And you don't know what that meant when you said that to us.
Yeah. Well, I certainly enjoyed working with you and enjoyed Jesse. What a great guy. He worked on the President Safety and Leadership Award, and so I got to see him every year, and that was a joy to always see him at those meetings and talk about a person who gave to the company and made it a better place. But yeah, it was a pleasure. It was a different aspect. You guys showed me a different view of the customers, and it gave me an opportunity to get out in the field and get on the trains. When I first started at Amtrak in the revenue management department, when I went back in 2000, I required all of the employees to take at least one train trip a year on a train that they hadn't traveled in the last 5 years. And I think that's missing.
Say that one more time, would you? Because that's just such music to our ears out here in the field. You required it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was part of their job performance, and if they didn't do it, it wasn't like I was going to fire them. But, if they were managing, the Acela, they couldn't just take the Acela. This was something that, it was a train that they had not traveled on in the last 5 years. And, I think it was an important part. And I certainly loved getting out on the train and traveling and talking to people and talking to employees. And, I'll say this, I was really blessed with several people and certainly working peripherally, very peripherally with the three of you and people like Joyce Smith and all, but Ed Quartermanch was a guy who worked in operations for years. And, he was like a mentor to me. It was like we'd go to lunch together, at least once or twice a week, and he would take me on trips. And we were in the planning department, and he'd take the whole planning department on a train trip for 2 or 3 days. And I learned so much from him. And I think it was important that I could then talk with people like you, and I could meet people because I experienced the train and I understood a little more about operations than just someone, in corporate. I think the other thing that helped me was that I started in Chicago, and we had this attitude as those people in corporate, they just have no idea what's going on, and they're doing really stupid things and they don't know it. And so I had that experience for 2 or 3 years to understand how that's how people looked at people in corporate. So I think I was empathetic to that view. So it was I had a lot of good help of people who helped me understand how the railroad worked, and helped introduce me to a number of people like yourself. So I was blessed to be able to experience that, kind of rich environment of Amtrak.
Well, to me, you're one of those rare, in my humble opinion, one of those rare numbers guys who understands the human factor. Because numbers guys are not necessarily anti-human. I don't mean to say that. They just don't make the connection about the humanity behind the numbers, and you always did. And,
Well,
and
thank
that's
you.
why you were such the asset to the corporation and to those of us in the field, especially that you were. Sir, thank you for your time, for your graciousness, for your honesty. Most importantly, thank you for being my friend.
And certainly the same with you, Griff. As always, you bring joy to the people you speak to, and it's
You're
always
kind.
fun to be with someone like you. So thanks for doing this. It's fun. I appreciate you taking the time and the energy, and you're real good at this, but also keeping a record. And I've looked at some of your other videos already, and I'm looking forward to others.
Well, let's just go ahead and put on the record what we talked about off the record before I hit record on this particular podcast, and that is, should this information exist 100 years from today, somebody is going to hopefully say, wow, I'm glad Bill Sheridan told us what it was like to be on the executive level at Amtrak, at the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st. What I was saying, ladies and gentlemen, imagine if you had the ability to plug into what the president of the New York Central or the Pennsylvania Railroad or even the Texas and Pacific Railway was thinking and doing 100 years ago. I bet those of us who have interest in the industry would take the opportunity to view those. So, sir, if nothing else, we have placed it on the historical record.
Thanks, Griff.
So,
Always a pleasure.
Thank you, sir.
The Texas Eagle Way, the way to and from and all points beyond. www.texaseagle.com. Y'all come on the way, the Texas Eagle Way, through the heart of the nation, a traveling sensation. Get your